The morning Elias Holt found his brother's body, the Mississippi Delta was drowning in fog. It rolled in off the bayou in thick white sheets, swallowing the cypress trees, muffling the world into something that felt less like nature and more like a warning. The cotton fields of Calhoun Parish, Louisiana stretched flat and silent in every direction, and in the middle of one of them, hanging from the low branch of a water oak, was what remained of Daniel Holt, 21 years old, freed 14 months, learning to read from a Methodist preacher who traveled the parishes on a mule with a Bible and a primer tucked under each arm. Daniel's crime, according to those who would never be asked to explain it in court, was signing his name to a land lease without a white man standing over his shoulder. He had done it in front of 3 witnesses. He had done it with a steady hand. And in Calhoun Parish in the autumn of 1869, that kind of confidence was considered a provocation. Elias cut Daniel down alone. He worked in silence, his breathing controlled, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years behind Confederate lines as a reconnaissance soldier for the Union's corps to freak, mapping roads, identifying supply caches, disappearing before dawn with information that saved hundreds of lives. His hands had done many things in those years. They had not shaken. They did not shake now. He wrapped his brother in a feed sack because he had nothing else. He carried him 2 miles through the fog to a patch of soft ground near the creek where their mother was buried, and he dug until the hole was deep enough that animals wouldn't find him. He lowered Daniel gently. He pressed the earth back down with his palms, and when it was done, Elias Holt sat with his back against a pine tree and did not cry, not because he lacked grief, but because grief had calcified inside him into something harder and more deliberate, something with a shape, something with a purpose. He had already begun to count. The group that called itself the Calhoun Protective Association operated out of a warehouse on the edge of Meridian Crossing, the parish's only town of any size. 24 men, some prosperous, some merely vicious, united by the conviction that the war had stolen something that was rightfully theirs, and that the people who'd been freed by it needed to be reminded of what freedom actually cost. They met on Wednesday nights. They kept no formal ledger, but their leader, a man named Harlan Goss, was a former Confederate artillery officer who understood the value of records. He kept notes in a leather journal, not of crimes, but of what he called administrative decisions, property disputes resolved, community order maintained, discipline enforced. He was also the justice of the peace for Calhoun Parish. From the Journal of Harlan Goss, dated October 3, 1869, the Holt matter concluded satisfactorily. The lease agreement has been voided. The missionary school north of town continues to draw attention. Well addressed before winter. The association is unified. No federal presence expected before spring. Elias read that entry 6 weeks later. Crouched in the shadow of Goss's office, having come through the window that faced the alley, the one with the broken latch that Goss had never gotten around to fixing. He had been watching the building for nights. He knew the patterns. He knew which deputy slept on duty and which one didn't. He knew that Goss took supper at the hotel on Tuesdays and walked home alone through the churchyard. He photographed nothing. Because photography required equipment he didn't have, he memorized instead. Names, dates, descriptions of events written in Goss's careful hand. The handwriting of an educated man who had never imagined anyone he considered beneath him would one day be reading his private thoughts. Elias put the journal back exactly as he found it, down to the angle it rested on the desk. He left no trace. He had learned to leave no trace the way other men learned to breathe. The first member of the Calhoun Protective Association died on a Tuesday evening in October. A man named Reeves Dalton, who had supplied the rope used on Daniel Holt and had afterward told the story at a card game as though it were amusing, was found the following morning at the bottom of the ravine behind the sawmill. His neck was broken. The assumption was that he had stumbled drunk in the dark, which was plausible because Dalton was frequently drunk in the dark, but someone had left a white hood on the sawmill door, pinned through the wood with an iron nail. No one mentioned it to the sheriff. No one had to. The association held an emergency meeting that Thursday. Voices raised about Yankee agitators, about federal provocateurs, about anything except the possibility that had begun to form in the back of certain minds like mold spreading through timber walls, that a freedman might have done it, that someone had the training, the patience, and the reason. The thought was uncomfortable enough that most of the men pushed it down and poured whiskey on top of it. From the Meridian Crossing Gazette, October 18, 1869. Local man Reeves Dalton, age 44. Died following an apparent accidental fall near the Piney Creek sawmill. No foul play is suspected. Sheriff Gideon Prale has closed the matter. Mr. Dalton is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. The second death came 11 days later. A man named Curtis Vane, who had been one of 4 men holding Daniel Holt while the rope was put around his neck, went out one morning to check his hog trap in the marshland behind his property and never returned. They found him 4 days later, face down in 6 inches of brackish water, a deep cut across his throat so clean and deliberate that the parish coroner, a man who had seen his share of violence, quietly noted in his report that the wound bore the characteristics of military application. He did not say this aloud to anyone. A white hood appeared on the step of the assignations meeting house that night, folded neatly, with a note tucked inside written in small even script. 20 to remain. The precision of that number disturbed Harlan Goss more than the deaths themselves. Whoever was doing this knew exactly how many members the association had, knew the roster, had access to information that was never written down, only spoken in closed rooms. He stood in his office with the note in his hand and felt something he had not felt since a Union battery had found the range of his position outside Vicksburg in '63. The feeling of being watched by someone who already knew where you were standing. Goss was not a man given to fear. He was given to calculation. He spread a map across his desk and began marking locations. The ravine where Dalton died, the marsh where Vane was found, the placement of the hood on the sawmill door, the hood on the meeting house step. A pattern was forming. Whoever this was, they were not acting from rage. Rage was sloppy. This was geometry. He thought about Daniel Holt, the young man they had hanged for signing a piece of paper. He thought about Daniel's older brother, the one who had served in the war, the one who had come back from it with the flat, quiet eyes of a man who had seen and done things that didn't dissolve at peacetime. He thought about how, at the funeral gathering in the Freedmen's Quarter, he had sent a deputy to watch, and the deputy had reported that Elias Holt stood motionless the entire time, not weeping, not speaking, just watching. Goss wrote one word in his journal that night, Holt. Then he closed it. The third killing broke the assignation's confidence in a way the first two had not. Bernard Ackley, the man who had kicked the crate from beneath Daniel Holt's feet, was found inside his own barn with a pitchfork driven through his chest with enough force to pin him to the wall behind him. His association robe was spread across the hay nearby, arranged with an almost theatrical care that implied the killer had stood over it and taken time. Ackley's face, those who found him reported, carried an expression that did not suggest surprise so much as a terrible last-second comprehension. 3 families left Calhoun Parish within the week. No explanations offered. Wagons loaded before dawn, gone before the dew burned off the fields. The association meeting that Wednesday drew only 17 men, and the conversation was no longer about maintaining order. It was about whether the order they had built was starting to collapse from underneath them. Elias Holt watched Ackley's body being removed from a distance of 200 yards, seated on a fence post with a piece of dried corn in his hand as though he were watching nothing in particular. A free man minding his own business on a public road. He had been awake for 36 hours. He felt nothing that could properly be called exhaustion. He had trained himself, in the marshes of Louisiana and the river bottoms of Mississippi, to run on something other than rest. Something colder and more reliable. He was thinking about his brother. Daniel had believed in the power of demonstration. Not force, but proof. Prove you are educated. Prove you are capable. Prove you can conduct commerce, own land, raise a family with dignity, and eventually the machinery of civilization would have to acknowledge you as part of it. He had believed this with the earnest confidence of a young man who had never yet learned that some machinery is not designed to be fixed, only replaced. Elias had loved him for that belief even while suspecting it would get him killed. And it had. So now Elias was offering a different kind of proof, that the machinery could break, that those who operated it could bleed. He was not naive about what this meant for him. He had no illusions about courts or sheriffs or federal oversight. He had watched Reconstruction from the inside, had carried dispatches to Union commanders, had seen the way federal commitment thinned at the edges like early ice on a pond, convincing from a distance, treacherous up close. He was not doing this because he expected justice. He was doing this because he had made a promise at his brother's grave, quiet and private, spoken into the earth while the fog rolled over him. He had promised Daniel that every man who had put their hands on him would spend whatever time remained to them in fear. That was not justice. It was arithmetic. From a letter recovered decades later, author unknown, likely written in the early 1870s. The hardest thing a soldier learns is not how to kill. That part comes easier than it should. The hardest thing is how to wait without hating the waiting. Because if you hate the waiting, you start to rush, and rushing is how you die. By November of 1869, the Calhoun Protective Association had stopped holding meetings at the warehouse. Too exposed, too predictable. They moved to different locations each week, different farms, different back rooms, telling no one the location until an hour before gathering. They thought this made them invisible. Frightened men always think that randomness will protect them. It never does, because fear has its own patterns, and Elias had spent his military career learning to read patterns the way other men read weather. He watched. He mapped. He waited. The fourth man to die was a tobacco farmer named Elias Crane, who had stood watch the night Daniel was taken, making sure no one from the freedmen's quarter followed the noise. They found Crane on the edge of the cemetery at dawn, buried to his neck in freshly turned earth, suffocated in the dark, his mouth still open from the last breath that hadn't come. His robe was spread across the ground above him like a burial shroud, and carved into the nearest tree in careful letters were the words, 18 more to settle. 5 more families left that week. Harlan Goss stood over Crane's exhumation and felt the arithmetic completing itself in his mind. This was not random retaliation. This was a campaign, planned, resourced, executed by someone with military training and personal motive and the kind of patience that comes from having nothing left to lose. He had the names of every man who had served in the corps to freak from this parish. He had contacts in the provost's office. He could make inquiries, but making inquiries would require explaining why he was making them, and explaining that would require acknowledging that a freedman was killing his people and the law could not stop it. And that acknowledgement was a form of defeat Goss was not yet prepared to accept. Instead, he made a plan. He called the remaining members of the association to his house on a Sunday afternoon, telling them separately, quietly, giving nothing away to their faces. He had begun to suspect, though he couldn't prove it, that someone was listening when they spoke in groups. The feeling of being observed had become constant and specific, like a hand resting on the back of your neck in a room where you could see no one behind you. We are going to set a trap, Goss told them. Whoever is doing this knows our habits, knows our faces, may know our names. He has been reactive, taking us when we are isolated. We will give him something irresistible. He spread a map, a gathering, announced publicly enough that word will reach the freedmen's quarter. We say the association is meeting at the Turner Mill, Friday at midnight. But we will not be at the Turner Mill. We will be at the Dupree Farm, 2 miles east, armed and waiting. When our hunter arrives at the mill, we flank him from the rear. 12 men, 3 positions. The plan had the clean logic of someone who had once been good at war. It accounted for the obvious vulnerabilities. It left almost nothing to chance. What it failed to account for was that Elias Holt was already inside the room when Goss described it. He had come in through the root cellar 2 hours before the meeting, had lain in the dark beneath the floorboards with his face 2 inches from the cold earth, breathing slowly, listening to the boots move above him. He had learned in the war that the best intelligence came not from watching from outside but from being already inside before anyone thought to check. He had listened to every word. He had mentally marked every name spoken. And when the meeting ended and the men drifted out one by one, he lay still for another 40 minutes, making certain, before he moved, the Turner Mill would be empty Friday night. The Dupree Farm would be full of armed men waiting for a ghost that would not come from the direction they expected. What happened at the Dupree Farm on Friday night has survived in fragments. In a deputy marshal's after-action report filed in February 1870, in the testimony of a woman named Cora Dupree who watched from her bedroom window and later gave a deposition she was pressured to recant, and in the account of a traveling physician named Marchetti who treated 2 of the survivors and described their wounds in clinical language, that told its own story. Elias had entered the Dupree barn the previous afternoon, moving during the hour when everyone in the parish was at the weekly market. He had found the crawl space beneath the structure and had spent 3 hours preparing it, learning the layout of the floor above him, identifying the positions where men would naturally stand when covering doorways and windows. He had brought rope. He had brought a blade. He had brought a tin of lamp oil, placed with care near the base of the central beam where the dry hay was thickest. He had brought the patience of a man who had once waited 11 hours in a Confederate supply depot with soldiers 10 feet away, and had come out the other side undetected. The association arrived at the Dupree Farm in groups, trying to appear casual, rifles under coats. 12 men settling into positions, watching the road that led toward the Turner Mill 2 miles away. waiting for the sound of a single man walking into their trap. They never heard him below them. The first man to die in the barn was pulled through a section of weakened flooring with a rope around his ankle, dropped into the crawl space where the noise he managed to make lasted less than 5 seconds. The others froze with that specific paralysis that occurs when the mind receives information it cannot immediately process, when the threat appears from an impossible direction. Then the shouting started, and the blind firing through the floor, and the chaos that Elias had anticipated and planned for. He was already at the support beam by the time they reached the door. He kicked it once, hard, at the angle he had calculated, and the northwest corner of the roof came down in a cascade of old timber and corrugated iron, taking one man with it and driving two others away from their positions. The lamp oil did what lamp oil does. The hay did the rest. Two men made it out of the burning barn. One of them Elias took in the darkness beyond the fire line. The other ran toward the road, and that left Harlan Goss and one remaining man standing in the field with the burning barn behind them, rifles up, scanning the darkness with the wide-eyed understanding that the evening had not gone according to their design. They were 50 yards from the tree line. The fire lit the field enough that moving toward the trees meant being visible for the entire approach. Goss was calculating this, turning slowly, when Elias spoke from the darkness directly behind him. "Put it down." His voice was quiet. Not a shout, not a threat delivered with heat. Just words, flat and final, like a door closing. Goss turned slowly. He could see almost nothing beyond the firelight, just a shape, a man standing at the edge of visibility with something in his hand. The second man, whose name was Fletcher, bolted for the tree line and made it 6 steps before the darkness swallowed a sound and swallowed him too. Now it was two men in a burning field. "You're Holt," Goss said. It was not a question. Elias stepped into the light. He had removed his hat. He wanted Goss to see him fully, wanted to deny the justice of the peace, the comfort of fighting a shadow. A man had done this. A specific man with a specific reason. That specificity mattered. "My brother's name was Daniel Holt," Elias said. "He was 21 years old. He signed a paper without asking your permission, and you wrote his name in your journal under administrative decisions. I read that entry." Goss's rifle was coming up and Elias watched it with the calm attention of someone for whom the trajectory of a barrel was simply information. "You have no legal standing here," Goss said. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not entirely. "You're a murderer. You've killed members of this community, members of the organization that hanged my brother for signing his name," Elias replied. He took one step forward. "You want to talk to me about legal standing in a parish where the justice of the peace runs the lynching parties?" Goss fired. The shot was wide, pulled by hands that had forgotten the particular steadiness that close-range violence requires. Elias moved before the sound finished, closing distance with a speed that surprised a man who thought he was facing a deliberate, patient killer rather than a trained soldier, who could also be fast when fast was called for. He got to the rifle before Goss could work the action. They went down together in the scorched grass, and what followed was not tactical, was not planned, was simply two men fighting with the absolute conviction that losing meant dying. Goss was strong and desperate. Elias was trained and precise. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference showed. When it was over, Elias had his knee on Goss's chest and the blade at his throat. The barn was still burning behind them. The field smelled of smoke and singed hay and blood from the cut on Elias's forearm where Goss had raked him with a ring. They were breathing hard. Their faces were close enough that each could see the other clearly, without the comfortable distance that made dehumanization easy. Elias pressed the blade harder. He felt the resistance in his own arm ease. He could end this now. He had ended 5 others with less reason, less proximity, less certainty. His brother's face was in his mind, not the way Daniel looked at the end, but the way he looked bent over his primer in the lamplight, mouth moving slightly as he sounded out words, proud in a way that had nothing arrogant in it, just the quiet satisfaction of a man becoming more than circumstances had permitted him to be. He lowered the knife. "You're going to walk back to Meridian Crossing tonight," Elias said. "You're going to tell whatever is left of your association that it's finished in this parish. No more meetings, no more decisions, no more discipline enforced." He kept his weight on Goss's chest. "Because if I hear about one school burned, one lease voided, one man taken in the night, I will come back. And I will not stop at the number I stopped at tonight." Goss stared up at him. His jaw worked. He was trying to reassemble the authority that the evening had stripped from him, trying to find the frame in which he was still the power and Elias was still the subject. You're letting me live," he finally said. Elias stepped back. "I'm making you carry it," he said. "Live with what a freedman chose to do with your life after you took his brothers. Tell your children. Tell them what you decided. See if they think you were right." He watched Goss pull himself to his feet. The justice of the peace was bleeding from his leg, limping, his coat scorched on one side. He looked nothing like the man who had sat behind a desk signing administrative decisions. He looked like exactly what he was. Elias turned to go. And that was the miscalculation. He heard the hammer click, felt the bullet before he fully understood that Goss had found the rifle in the grass while Elias was stepping back, had come up on one knee, had fired with the focused ferocity of a man who understood that mercy, in the grammar of this world, was not a language spoken by those who intended to survive. The shot caught Elias in the upper back, left of center. He went down hard, and the cold damp ground came up to meet him with an intimacy that felt final. He could hear his own breathing, ragged, shallow, the sound of something damaged. He could hear Goss moving, the footsteps of a man approaching rather than retreating. "You should have finished it," Goss said above him. His voice had recovered its steadiness. "I appreciate the lesson you were trying to teach. But lessons only work when the teacher lives long enough to see them stick." He raised the rifle. A second shot split the night, but not from Goss's rifle, from the tree line. A woman named Judith Kane stepped into the firelight holding a shotgun she had carried for 400 yards from her farm, at a dead run when she heard the barn explode into fire. She was 60 years old. She had been enslaved for 42 of them. She had been free for 4 years in a parish that kept explaining to her what freedom meant. She was breathing hard and her hands were shaking, but the barrel was level and it was aimed at Harlan. Goss and she had fired at once into the air as a warning, and she was clearly prepared to adjust her aim. Goss turned to face her. His expression moved through several calculations visibly. "You want to shoot a justice of the peace, Judith," he said, in front of witnesses. Judith's eyes did not move from the center of his chest. "I want you to step back from that man," she said. "And I want you to put that rifle on the ground. And then I want you to think very carefully about which story gets told in the morning. Because I have been a witness to a great many things in my life, and I can talk for a long time if someone asks me to." The silence that followed was thick and specific. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird was calling. The barn was settling into its own embers. Elias was pressing his hand against his back wound and listening to the conversation above him with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine everything. Goss set the rifle down, not because of the shotgun, though the shotgun mattered, but because Judith Kane's threat was more precise than any bullet. The records she could speak to, the events she had witnessed, the names she knew and could give to the right people, were more dangerous to him than any wound Elias had managed to inflict. The war had changed the arithmetic of consequences, and Goss was capable enough to read arithmetic. He walked away into the dark, limping, leaving his rifle in the grass. Judith knelt beside Elias. Her hands were sure and practical. She had worked as a field nurse during the occupation and she understood wounds. This one was bad but not immediately fatal. The bullet had struck muscle rather than bone, had passed through cleanly. She packed it with cloth torn from her apron and told him in a voice that allowed no disagreement that he was going to stay still and breathe while she went for help. "You should have let me finish him," Elias said, his voice trady. Judith stood. "Maybe," she said. "But now you're alive and he's afraid, and that's a different kind of power than a dead man has." She paused. "Daniel would have wanted you alive." He had no answer to that. The federal deputy marshal, who arrived the next morning, was a man named Theodore Vass, 34 years old, appointed under the Reconstruction Acts, a veteran of the Army of the Tennessee who had walked enough scorched earth to know what organized violence looked like when it tried to pass itself off as accident and community defense. He had been summoned by a wire sent before dawn from a source he would later decline to identify in his official report. He found Elias Holt in a farmhouse near the tree line, his wound dressed, his eyes clear, and his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who has already decided what he is willing to say and what he is not. He found the ruins of the Dupree barn. He found, by count, 4 deceased members of the Calhoun Protective Association. He found Judith Kane's account, delivered in the kind of precise and unadorned language that depositions prefer, describing Harlan Goss standing over a wounded unarmed man with a rifle raised. He also found tucked beneath the floorboards of Goss's office by a method of entry no one could explain. A set of copied pages from Goss's journal, documenting 2 years of organized racial violence in Calhoun Parish. Dates, names, descriptions, in Goss's own hand. The originals were still in the journal, undisturbed. Someone had copied them with the clean attention of a man who understood that evidence needed to exist in more than one place. Goss was arrested on the morning of November 21, 1869. He was taken to New Orleans to await federal prosecution. He did not go quietly, and the expression on his face as they put him in the transport wagon was not defeat. It was postponement. Men who had operated inside systems of power for decades understood the difference. Elias testified before the federal commission 6 weeks later, seated in a chair in a building in New Orleans that smelled of salt air and old wood. He gave his account in the same flat, precise language he had used for everything since the night he found his brother. He named names. He described events. He presented the copied journal pages as evidence. The commission listened. They asked questions that suggested they believed him. They filed reports that suggested they intended to act. From the record of the Federal Reconstruction Commission, New Orleans District, January 14, 1870, the testimony of Elias Holt, formerly of Calhoun Parish, Louisiana, has been received and entered into evidence. The commission finds substantial credibility in the witness account and recommends the prosecution of Harlan Goss on charges of conspiracy to commit racially motivated murder. The commission further recommends increased federal presence in the parish pending resolution. Harlan Goss was tried in March of 1870. His attorneys were accomplished and expensive and understood that the actual law was less relevant to the outcome than the composition of the jury, the temperament of the judge, and the patience of the federal government. The jury deliberated for 31 minutes. Not guilty on all charges, Elias received the news in a rooming house in New Orleans where he had been staying under a false name. He sat with it for a long time. Outside, the city was loud with commerce and argument and the sound of a world that had not paused for his verdict. He thought about Daniel bending over his primer. He thought about Moses, the old man who had intervened at the church in the original story. And he thought about Judith Kane standing in a burning field with a shotgun, her hands shaking but her aim true, making the calculation that survival was a form of resistance that deserved to be protected. He left New Orleans the following week. He went north, not running, not fleeing, but moving with the deliberate intention of a man who understood that some battles could not be won in their own territory, in their own time, by their own hands. Chicago received him in the spring of 1870 with its smell of industry and its noise of possibility and its peculiar northern version of the same old arrangements wrapped in different language. He found work. He found a room. He found, eventually, a small community of people who had come north carrying the same silences, the same shaped hollow where something used to be, the same knowledge that freedom was a word that described an aspiration more than a condition. He used a different name for many years, not from cowardice, but from the practical understanding that Harlan Goss had friends and some friends had long memories. He never stopped teaching. Not formally, not in a school with a sign above the door, but in the way that people who have learned things under pressure teach, in kitchens and on front stoops and in the back rooms of churches that stayed open late. He taught young men who had come north running from the same machinery he had tried to break with his hands. He taught them what he had learned and what he wished he had known earlier, and what his brother's death had clarified. With terrible precision, he taught them that power built on terror could be met and could be shaken, that the people who had been made to feel inevitably powerless were not, had never been, that the fear flowed in both directions once someone decided to redirect it. He taught them this with the authority of someone who had proven it, at considerable cost. In a burning field in Louisiana in the autumn of 1869. He also taught them what Judith Kane had taught him on the ground with a cloth pressed against his back wound. That survival was its own form of resistance. That living long enough to teach the next person was not a lesser act than dying in the field. That Daniel had been right about education and he had been right about fear, and neither of them had been entirely right alone. From the Chicago Defender. April 2, 1914, Elias Carter, age 74, passed quietly at his home on the South Side. A veteran of the Union Army and longtime resident of this city, Mr. Carter was known in his community as a tireless advocate for the education and protection of young men newly arrived from the South. He is survived by no immediate family, but by the many lives he shaped over for decades of quiet, determined service. He will be missed. The obituary did not mention Calhoun Parish. It did not mention Daniel Holt or Harlan Goss or the winter when a freedman had made 24 members of a terror organization understand what it meant to be hunted. It did not mention that he had kept, in a wooden box under his bed until the day he died, a single page torn from Harlan Goss's journal, the entry with Daniel's name in it, not as a trophy and not as a wound, but as a record. Proof that it had happened. Proof that a man had written his brother's name in a ledger as a problem to be solved, and that the solution had not gone as planned. Harlan Goss served as justice of the peace in Calhoun Parish for 9 more years after his acquittal. He died in 1881 in his own bed, which some people in the parish thought was more than he deserved and others thought was exactly the kind of ending that powerful men arranged for themselves. What they said about him in certain quarters, in quiet voices in the freedmen's communities that persisted through terror and dispersal and the long, slow violence of the decades that followed, was not about his death. It was about the winter when he had been afraid, when he had walked away from a field with his rifle in the grass and a freedman standing behind him, alive and watching, when the order he had spent years building had fractured at the edges and let in cold air and the knowledge that it could fracture further. Some nights in Louisiana, when the fog rolls in off the bayou the way it did the morning Elias found his brother. Old families in the parishes along the creek roads still talk about that winter. They talk about white hoods appearing on doors as warnings rather than threats, about powerful men who stopped sleeping well, about the arithmetic of terror running backward for one season, in one parish, because one man with nothing left to lose decided to make it run that way. They talk about what Elias Holt proved, that the machine could be hurt, that the people operating it were not invulnerable. That cruelty maintained its position only as long as the people subjected to it accepted it as permanent. He did not make it permanent the other direction. He understood, finally, what his brother had known and what Judith Kane had demonstrated in a burning field, that the point was never to reverse the hierarchy. The point was to survive it long enough to dismantle it. That required patience that felt like surrender, strategy that felt like weakness, the willingness to walk away from a man who deserved killing and choose instead the harder work of teaching the next generation how to fight without becoming the machine they were fighting against. The land records in Calhoun Parish show a gap in 1869, an unusual number of property transfers in the months following that November, white landowners selling or abandoning holdings to freedmen who had been there, working that same soil, for 2 and 3 generations. It was a small shift, a partial crack in the arrangement. It did not hold forever. The arrangement reasserted itself with the end of Reconstruction and the long, brutal decades that followed. But in those records, in that gap, in those land transfers dated November through December 1869, you can see the moment when an entire community of people who had been told they were powerless learned otherwise. Not because the law protected them, not because the system worked, but because one man, armed with military training and grief and a patience that had calcified into something structural, decided to make the cost of their terror too high for one season, in one parish, and that was enough to shift the ground slightly, to let something breathe that had been held under for years. It is still not finished. The work his students began, carried forward by their students and their students after them, runs through every courthouse battle and every moment of organized resistance and every community that has refused to disappear under pressure. It runs through the long and unfinished argument about what freedom actually means and what it costs and who pays for it. Elias Holt went north with nothing but what he could carry. He died with his brother's name in a box under his bed. He left behind dozens of people who knew things they would not have known otherwise, who carried that knowledge forward into a future he did not live to see. He never received justice for Daniel. He never watched Harlan Goss face the consequences that the law was supposed to deliver. He spent 40 years under a false name in a city that asked fewer questions than the one he had left. But on certain nights in Chicago, when the wind comes down cold off the lake, people who knew him or knew people who knew him talk about the way he held himself, upright and deliberate, like a man who had settled accounts to the extent that settling was possible and had made peace with the remainder. Like a man who understood that some debts are too large to be closed in one lifetime, but that each payment matters, each act of resistance ripples forward. Each person who survives long enough to teach the next one is adding to a total that will one day be collected. Daniel Holt signed his name to a piece of paper in August of 1869, and it cost him everything. His brother carved a different kind of signature into the history of Calhoun Parish. One written not in ink but in the fear of men who had believed themselves untouchable, in the courage of a woman standing in a burning field, in the knowledge passed through generations in back rooms and church basements and borrowed kitchens. That signature does not appear in the official records, but it is there, in the gap in the land transfers, in the deposition Judith King gave and was pressured to recant and gave again anyway, in the copied pages of a journal that a freedman produced from inside a locked office that no one could explain how he had entered. It is still there, and the work it began is still unfinished.